Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. I'm your host, David Holloway, and it's brilliant as always to be here with you. And as you can see, the wonderful Paul Bindig is back with us. How are you, Paul?
I'm happy to be back. I've missed you, David. I know you've had to fly solo with some guests, and so I'm pleased to be invited back to join the fray.
And look, I did actually put in the running sheet, joining me is the wingman who flies two planes at once. So I feel that's a good enough line to warrant repeating, even though we're already past that point.
I don't even know what that means, but...
Well, I just think you're that good as a wingman. You can fly two planes at once.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought it was a reflection on how incredibly busy my life is, which I thought that's pretty accurate. So
yeah, well, there is that
either
too.
way, all good.
There is that too. So no, look, we're really excited to be here today, and we're particularly excited with the guest that we've just finished interviewing. So Steve Nathan is not a name you may recognise off the cuff, but as you'll hear, well, actually, a lot of our keyboard player listeners will actually recognise Steve's name. But his career, and I know we've said it with a number of our guests, has been incredible and diverse. Well, it doesn't get much more diverse than what Steve's achieved over his 40-plus year career and still going. We'll only cover a small proportion of that in these two parts, but we think you'll get a lot of value out of it. Paul, Steve, some of the stuff just incredible.
Yeah, and this is what comes from being at the absolute top of the session musician game in one of the busiest recording studios in the world. It's as simple as that. So Steve's worked with everyone and has some great anecdotes and stories to tell. And it's just a really fascinating chat. And you know, he's a really generous guy. With like we always say, all our keyboard playing guests they're generous with their time and their thoughts, and they're lovely to talk to. So it's an interview we loved. We were looking forward to it, and it certainly didn't disappoint, did it, David?
No, absolutely. So here's part one of our chat with Steve Nathan. Steve, can't thank you enough on a Friday night. I mean, I'm sure, you know, like us, you're not a big party animal on a Friday night, but we do appreciate you taking the time.
They're all the, you know, I'm pretty retired these days, so they're all about the same.
Yeah, that's right. I'm hearing you. So, no, absolute pleasure to have you on. So, yeah, I thought we'd kick off with just a talk about, obviously, your amazing career, and it's still ongoing career, but it's kick off with your musical upbringing. What kicked you off in music not so many years ago?
Oh, gosh. You know, people often ask me, well, how did you get into music? And my stock answer is always that I didn't know there was a choice. I was apparently showed some interest. I was thinking about this actually earlier today. We were the only family in the neighborhood in 1951-52 that had a television, I remember. And my dad was a player. He was a businessman, but he played in college. He was in a big band and that. And he gave it up to go into business with his brother. But my dad told me when he was alive that he had this sense that I was hearing that when I would sing TV commercials that I'd heard on the television, he had this sense that I was singing them in the key they were in on the television. And so he paid attention and, you know, went over to the piano and sort of got a sense of what key I was singing in, and then noticed that the commercial would come on again, and sure enough, I was in the same key. And he thought that was kind of cool. By the time I was 3, I had an older brother. I had 2 older brothers. My oldest brother was the first to sort of be forced to take piano lessons. And he was not a musician. He would have much preferred to be outside hitting some kind of ball with some kind of a stick. But I was 3 years old, and they tell me I sat just fascinated, watching his entire lesson. And then when his teacher left and he'd go out to hit the balls or whatever, I would pull myself up onto the piano bench and try to play what I had heard them playing. So he talked to the teacher, and the teacher said 3's pretty early, but he clearly seems interested, so I started taking piano lessons at the age of 3. And she was an interesting teacher. I didn't know it at 3 o'clock, at the age of 3, but she was, how do I put this? She played piano at Murphy's Omega Lounge, which was a hot spot in what you would call the red light district of Buffalo, New York. So a rough joint, lots of drunks and hookers and whatever else, and she was the piano player there. And that's who I took lessons from for, I'm going to say maybe 4 years, 5 years. And then she told my dad, I can't do much more for him, and he found a guy named Danny Kane, who was he was musical director for Andy Williams, lived in the area. He became my teacher until I was 16, I think, and he moved pretty far away by the time I was 16, and my mother had gone back to work she was a registered nurse, head nurse. And so getting to a piano lesson meant a whole lot of long bus trips. And I sort of blew it off at that point. But I took the regular, sort of classical, typical kid piano lessons. And Danny Kane was a great guy and a great player, but he didn't catch on. At the end of every lesson, he would say, all right, now this week we're going to do this. And he would play it for me, and I want you to work on this, and he would play it for me, and I would hear it, and I would remember it, and I never really learned to read very well because I had such a good ear. So I got away with that for a long time. But that's how I learned to play, and like I said, I just had the drive that so many of us just have and can't really do anything else but. So by the time I was, I don't know, maybe 13, I started a band with the kid down the street and another guy in my school, and we didn't have any gear. We did what we could. And then when I was maybe 14, I got my very first Wurlitzer electric piano, and my dad was quite a stickler for lessons and learning values and things like that. He easily could have bought me this Wurlitzer electric piano for $50 at the time. But instead, he took me down to the corner bank, and he co-signed for a loan so that I would learn the value of the instruments. It was a great lesson, and I wish I still had that Wurlitzer. It was a beautiful old dark brown tube Wurlitzer. And then I started to get into bands, and we had I had a band. We named ourselves the Offbeats, and Joe used to tell people this all the time. I said we were so young that when people would call us the Beat Offs and laugh, we didn't get it. We didn't know what they were talking about. We were that young. And that's what I did. I played in bands, just like everybody, I think. You become a teenager, you start playing at school dances and things like that. I was kind of the go-to guy. I went to an integrated high school in the 60s, and I became known among the singing, dancing black students in my school. I became known as the guy who could play the songs they wanted to do with the right feel. So at every talent show, I was the musician backing up, the James Brown impression guy, or the three girls who did Supreme songs. So, and that was that carried me for I did the usual things, played in bowling alleys and wherever you could. And then before long, I started to find myself as the youngest guy in a band with fairly older guys, and struggling because they could get gigs in bars, and I was too young to play in the bars, and so there was a bit of bit of wrangling with my folks about that, and I first played in a bowling alley that served alcohol, and they let me get away with that. And before long, they just gave up, and I got fake ID or whatever I had to do. And for a long time, I was the kid in the band, playing with much older guys, and that's how I got started.
Steve, in your younger years, your formative years, through your teens, as you were playing more and more, and what was your favourite kind of music back then? Was it just any music, or were there particular things that you loved to play?
I had a certain amount of broad interest. My dad was a jazz player, and so I grew up. The records in the house were Dave Brubeck and Horace Silver. I loved Ray Bryant. I loved Bobby Timmons, Cannonball Adderley. But my mother also liked Broadway show tunes a lot, so we had a lot of cast records for that sort of stuff. And I grew up trying, mostly leaning towards trying to play jazz. And my dad was such a pivotal figure in my becoming a musician. My dad took me to bars that even not many white people went to. When I was 10, 11, 12 years old, he took me to see, he took me to see Cannonball. He took me to see Jimmy Smith. He took me to see Groove Holmes. He took me to see Jack McDuff. He took me to see all kinds of people in these places where I was this little kid. I sat in with Kay Winding when I was 11. It was quite an education. He also took me out to there was a bar out by the Bethlehem Steel Mill where a guy named Stan Celeste had a band, Stan and the Ravens. And they were the rock and roll band in Buffalo, New York. And Stan was, with no exaggeration, Stan influenced every rock piano player in Buffalo. He was a member of, I don't know if these names will all translate, he was in Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, and he played in bands with Robbie from the band.
Robbie Robertson?
Robertson. He played with Levon, he played with Rick Danko. He played with all of those guys for many years. And I remember I'm going to say, do you remember what year it was Bob Dylan went electric? Because that would be the year it was.
It was, I'm going to shame myself here. I'm going to say 67, but I think it's earlier than that. I apologise.
A little earlier than that, but not much. The year Bob Dylan went electric, my dad, this is another long story, but my dad had started to venture away from his fiberglass business with his brother into doing concert promotion. And so he was promoting a show with Bob Dylan. At the time, Bob was going electric. And I remember, there's two things I really remember distinctly from that show. The first one was that Bob himself came into the ticket office at the box office and told my dad, I'm going to come out and I'm going to play with just me and my guitar for 30 minutes, and then we're going to have an intermission. The show is sold out. Every ticket's sold, right? And my dad said yes. He said, okay, now when I come back from intermission, I'm going to come back with the band and play electric. And when I do, a lot of people are going to boo and they're going to walk out. So when that happens, I just want to be sure that you sell those seats again. And that was kind of eye-opening for me. I was young enough to just think of Bob Dylan as this sort of countercultural hero, but he was definitely all wrapped up in, I'm going to make more money because people are going to walk out and we can sell their seats. But the other is when the band came out, they came out by themselves to do one or two songs, and before they played a note, they said, it sure is great to be back in Buffalo. home of Stan Celeste. Coming to Buffalo has always been like school for us. So I played in bands with Stan, 2 keyboard bands for a long time. So I've sort of jumped back and forth. You were asking me about...
No, but that's great, Stephen. I mean, it links nicely with, essentially by the age of 16, you've got 13 years of lessons and experience under your belt, which a lot of human beings that play keyboards won't have. How did that then move for you through that next phase as far as deciding, well, I'm going to do this full time, and obviously you move to where you're located now, if that's not too far a jump ahead?
Well, I not directly, and I think I have to at least sort of explain how. Like I said, my dad was a jazz musician, and I grew up listening to all, and I grew up playing, whatever I could off of Take 5, and imitating Les McCann and trying to play these things, and throughout this time, my dad is just sort of dipping his toes into doing concert promotion. He put on 2 jazz festivals with George Wein, and I met a lot of. Cannonball Adderley came to the house for dinner one night and heard me. My dad had me show him I was trying to learn Mercy Mercy, and I don't know, I was probably butchering it or whatever. Cannonball comes back to my house the next night with Joe Zawinul in tow to give me a lesson. So I had all of that sort of background, but then my older brother started bringing home records, like he started bringing home, Wilson Pickett, and I heard Johnny Johnson play with Chuck Berry, and I was like, boom, I took an immediate hard left, probably broke my dad's heart, but all of a sudden I wanted to play that music, and that's kind of the direction I went. And so I was in blues bands and soul bands for many years, and struggling to get gigs because I wasn't playing top 40. You would play these blues gigs as long as you could for the little money that they paid, and then you'd have to put on a funny suit for a little while and go play the latest hits until you put enough money, got ahead enough on your bills to go back to going, I'm not doing that anymore. And I go play more blues and R&B. And I did that for a long time, and I kind of shuffled around doing that. And I had a couple of kind of side trips. I went to a friend of mine. I had worked in a club in Niagara Falls for a long time, which was a 2-stage, 2-band club. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for a club to hire a house band, and you get the gig for a year sometimes, or sometimes longer. I remember you could. We had 2 keyboard players. Jimmy Poland owned a Hammond D, and I would go to the piano store in Buffalo, where you could buy a used upright for $100. They would deliver it to the club that you were playing in, and then you would play it until the gig was over, and then you'd leave it. And when you moved into the next club, you'd go back to the piano store and you'd buy another piano for $100, and they'd deliver it. And you'd stick, contact mics on rubber balls stuck on the soundboard or whatever you had to do to get the sound out of them. And I did that for quite a while and shifted in and out. In one of those clubs in Niagara Falls, there was a guy in the other band named Gary Baker. He's gone on to become an extremely successful songwriter, record producer. And he called me and wanted me to come join a band he had in Houston, Texas. Me and the guitar player from my band went to Houston. We played down there for a while. We did a lot of traveling. We ended up in a hotel lounge in Detroit for a while off a 9-mile road. And then I'd go back to Buffalo, and then somebody else would offer me a gig someplace else. And the last time, the whole band that I had in Buffalo got a call from a guy in St. Petersburg, Florida. They were opening a new club just for him, and he needed a band, and it was great pay and a great gig and all that. And we all packed up all of our gear, everything we could, and we drove to Florida. We got to St. Petersburg. There was an IRS padlock on the front of the club, and no gig. So, we scrambled and did what we could, found another club, got another gig, and then once again, Gary Baker calls me, and he's in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and he says, "I've got a gig for you. I got a great gig. Come on up, how soon can you get here?" So again, it was hard to say goodbye to my band. These were my best friends, but it was very clear to me then that what Gary was offering had upward mobility. This gig was, you were going on a tour. They had a top 10 record. It was definitely a good move. So I quit my band. I pack up all my stuff in my little Fiat sports car that I removed the back seat from so I can get a Rhodes into it. And I drive to Muscle Shoals, where I discover I have an audition, not a gig. And I'm pretty wigged, but Gary tells me, and he said many times, he says, I didn't tell you it was an audition because I was afraid you wouldn't come, and I knew you'd get the gig. So I got the gig, and I did my first short stint on the road, confirmed that I don't like the road. But this was a duo. It had been, the record was a duo. Lenny LeBlanc and Pete Carr were called LeBlanc and Carr. They had a big hit record. It was in the top 10 at the same time as 6 or 7 Bee Gee records from Saturday Night Fever. So it was a really big record. And they'd started a tour on it, and half of the duo, Pete Carr, the guy who produced it, and a tremendous guitar player, he didn't hold up well to the rigors of the road. He'd had some, we'll just say, personality issues and stability issues. He didn't hold up well, and he left. So I'm out there with this band that's a duo with only half of the duo out on the front of the stage every night. So that was over in less than 6 months. Record company said, we can't keep doing this. We got to get you, the artist, Lenny. We got to get you back to Muscle Shoals. You got to cut a new record. So goes back to Muscle Shoals, books the studio time, and out of the road band, I'm the only one he asks to come do the record. The rest of the band is studio players, well-established studio players. Roger Clark on drums and Bob Ray, and so I go to Fame Studio for my first time, and I remember when I had first driven into Muscle Shoals for what I didn't know was an audition, and I remember distinctly thinking to myself, as I passed Fame Studios, I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if they'd ever just let me in there to look around. How cool would that be? And so here I am. I'm going to play on a record at Fame Studios. And so we get started, and the engineer was a guy named Don Daly. He was a great engineer, but on the first little break, he goes upstairs to Rick Hall's office, and he tells Rick, you better come down here and hear this keyboard player. Which I didn't know, but Rick Hall comes down and he sits in the control room and he listens to us play, and he listens to me apparently. And at the end of the session, he comes over to me and he introduces himself and he goes, I'm starting Adobe Gray record next week. I'd like you to play on it. And that was the first of 13 or 14 years I played on every record he made from then on.
Which Steve could be a whole podcast series on its own, and we're going to try our best to cover some of the highlights of that. So you mentioned quite succinctly there that you turned up for the audition, thought, gee, I'd like to get in there. one day. What was the actual audition? It was the matter of just working with these artists and them deciding that you fit in, or was there a more formalised audition?
Well, the audition was to get into LeBlanc and Carr, and they set up in the rehearsal hall. I sat down, and played what they asked me to play, and they went, "You're hired." That was all it was. With Rick Hall, he just listened to me play, and he said, "I like the way you play. I'm going to hire you." And then everything just sort of spreads from that. People heard me play on the Dobie Gray record, and the drummer and the bass player or whatever, they're talking to some other musicians, and they go, "Man, we heard this keyboard player. He played on Dobie Gray. He's pretty good. We should try him on this or try him on that." And I just started getting calls. Now, I also had for me, it was good fortune. For him, it was not good fortune, but there was, in Muscle Shoals at the time, Barry Beckett was at Muscle Shoals Sound. Clayton Ivey was at Wishbone Studios. And Randy McCormick was a freelancer who primarily worked out of Muscle Shoals Sound, and he was their second keyboardist. And their first keyboardist anytime Barry didn't want to play. So all of the rest of there were a lot of studios in Muscle Shoals, and all of the other sort of freelance keyboard work went to a guy who was not a happy guy, and he committed suicide. I hate to even mention that, but there was this sort of opening. Muscle Shoals was very tight and together, and they didn't, once they gave you the gig, you got the gig as long as you showed up when they wanted you to show up. If you took a tour and you went on the road for 3 months, your gig was gone when you came back. They'd find somebody else. They weren't interested in your career. They were interested in how you could help them with their career. So I turned down some good tours over the years, but I stayed there, and word of mouth spread pretty quickly, and songwriters were hiring me to play on their demos, and some of the other producers who had heard I was good would hire me to play on something, and then they would like what I played, and they kept hiring me. So pretty soon I was, the busiest freelance keyboard player in the area.
It certainly sounds like it. And so, Steve, Paul and I had discussions before recording this, and your amazing list of credits, as I said, you nearly need a podcast series. So what we've done is just chosen somewhat at random some artists we'd love your thoughts and perspective on. But also, please feel free to jump to any others, because you're the one that's lived this experience. So if we haven't hit the main marks, then please jump in as well. So do you mind if we just sort of throw some names at you and we see where that takes us?
Go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Steve. So let me kick off with Percy Sledge. What's some key recollections working with Percy Sledge?
I didn't do a lot of recording with Percy Sledge, but I did some, and I had not gotten to Muscle Shoals when he cut "When a Man Loves a Woman," which was the big huge hit that he had that he was known for. But he was still cutting records in Muscle Shoals with I think David Johnson was producing him when I first worked for him at Broadway Studios. And Percy was he was a nice, amiable, he was a good singer. He was just a sort of a simple, straight ahead, unassuming kind of a guy. He liked to sing. He had been an orderly in the Sheffield Hospital, and somebody heard him singing in the halls as he was mopping or something of that sort, and told somebody in one of the studios about him, and that's how he got his start. I actually backed him up live a couple of times for award shows. I remember once this is many years later, they have something called the Alabama Music Hall of Fame, and they put on a banquet every year and induct people into it. And I was, because nobody else would sort of step up, I was the band leader. I stood there and pretended I knew how to wave my hands and signal cutoffs and that sort of stuff. But I remember it was it had been many years since he'd cut that song, and we had a rehearsal. We'd had a rehearsal in Muscle Shoals. The gig was in Birmingham, and I remember thinking, "Gosh, it's killing him to still hit these notes in the key of C. It's just really tearing up his voice." And I turned to the band after one of the rehearsals. I said, "Let's knock this down to B. Let's give him a break." And then we got the sound check and we kicked it off in B, and he started to sing it, and he stopped us in the first verse. He said, "What key are you playing in?" And I told him, "Well, we knocked it down to B so it wouldn't be so hard, such strength." He said, "Oh, no, I sing it in C. C is my key." And it was almost painful. I could, but that's where he sang it, and that's where he wanted to sing it, and he knew we weren't in C. He could feel it. So
that's amazing. Yeah. And apologies, Steve, in the intro too, we're going to jump forwards and backwards in time. We're going to cover lots of older and newer artists that you've worked with, and obviously some of them not at Muscle Shoals. So from one extreme, from Percy Sledge to Huey Lewis.
Oh, I only did one record with Huey Lewis. He came to Nashville because I think it was Capitol Records had come up with this idea of country salutes the Beatles, kind of, I forget what the title was. But it was country artists singing Beatles songs, and some of them were duets, and some of them were not country artists. They may have called it America Salutes the Beatles. I don't know, whatever it was. Huey Lewis came to Nashville to sing "Oh Darling." I played piano on it. He was, what I remember most about him, other than besides being a really nice guy and really friendly and singing great and all that, he seemed particularly impressed with the studio, the capabilities of the studio, our headphone systems, our mic selection. I think it never occurred to him that Nashville would have studios that weren't just on par with Los Angeles or New York, but were actually, in many cases, better equipped and better sounding rooms. He was clearly surprised and kind of blown away at what we had, and he loved the band. The band killed him. Well, a lot of times you'll get non-country artists will come into Nashville and get a band of Nashville players, and they're surprised that they can play anything that isn't country music. A guy told me a story the other. I hate to veer off, but I have a friend, Steve Gibson. He's a guitar player, and he's played on hundreds of country hit records. And in addition to being a great musician and having played on so many great country records, he's a very conservatively looking. He doesn't look like a musician. He dresses and he cuts his hair. He looks like an accountant or an insurance salesman or something. He's very, very non-musician looking. And Norbert Putnam took him with some other musicians over to England to cut a record for George Harrison. And George Harrison had signed this band to his label and hired Norbert to produce it. And they all get over there, and all of the other musicians are scruffy. They got long hair. They have holes in their jeans. And Steve Gibson's wearing a permanent press iron shirt and some khaki slacks and very short hair. As soon as they get there, George Harrison pulls Norbert aside and he goes, "Who is this?" And he says, "Well, that's my guitar player." And he goes, No. He says, "No, I think you've brought the wrong you brought the wrong guy. I need a real rocking guitar player." And Norbert says, "Well, Steve's a really good player." No, I'm sorry, he just doesn't look like he's going to fit in. And Norbert convinces him, "Let us get started, and then if you don't like him, we'll send him back to Nashville. We'll get you somebody else." So Harrison leaves to go do something, run an errand or whatever, and he comes back, and they're in the room, and Steve Gibson is overdubbing the guitar solo on the track, And George Harrison comes in and he looks out there and he sees him playing and he hears what he's playing and he turns to Norbert Putnam and he goes, "He's bloody Clark Kent." Well, I loved that story.
That's brilliant.
Yes. So I keep veering off here. Throw some more people.
They're great veer-offs. Go for it.
No, that's 100% fine. They're amazing stories, so please feel free to share, Steve. We're enjoying them. Levon Helm, who you already mentioned.
Levon I did a few things with, and those were records I did with where Barry Beckett and I both played. And so remembering exactly what I played it's been a long time. But typically, Barry might play Wurlitzer and I'd play organ, or I'd play piano and Barry would play organ. Most of that stuff was going to be organ, piano, Wurlitzer, and not much else. I had all my I had synth gear set up, but I probably didn't touch it. And Levon was Levon. Levon's great. He's extremely cool. And what I remember most about Levon is that when we were cutting Jerry Reed at Fame in the same time period, and we had finished tracking Levon, but he's still in the studio doing vocals, doing overdubs, all of that. And I've started a Jerry Reed record at Fame. And I just remember Levon came over in his bus to Fame, and me and Jerry Reed got on Levon's bus and got very, very high. He had unbelievably strong pot, like nothing I had ever smoked. And then I got off the bus after a while and left the two of them on there, and then I've gone to the little market on the corner, and I come back out and Reed spots me with like a bag of chips or something, and he comes running off the bus and he grabs the chips away from me. Starts.
Go the munchies.
Yeah, he definitely had the munchies. But Reed was a character. He was a lot of fun.
No, that's great. No, that's excellent. Probably less pot involved with this next anecdote, the Staple Singers.
Yeah, again, I didn't do a lot with the Staple Singers. I did a little bit of one of their records. I say a little bit, I don't remember how much, but I did one of their records. And again, I didn't get there until long after I'll Take You There and some of those bigger hits. I was particularly thrilled to be playing with Pop Staples. I thought he was a really cool guitar player. And of course, getting to hear Mavis Staples sing in your headphones couldn't be beat. But I more remember cutting. I did a track. We cut The Wait, the band song The Wait. It was a duet on. We did another one of those. I don't know whether it was Country Meets Who. We did one on the songs of the Eagles, and then we did another one. It was sort of a country R&B blend. So Marty Stewart and the Staple Singers did The Wait. That's what it was. We cut Patches with Sam Moore and Conway Twitty. We cut Since I Fell for You with Reba McEntire and Natalie Cole. I didn't play on every song on that record. There's some really good ones. The Al Green and Lyle Lovett cut was very, very cool. It's one of my biggest disappointments in that whoever was in charge of keeping track of the credits did not keep track of the credits. So at the end of when it came time to turn in the credits, they just looked and they went, okay, well, there's 3 keyboards players, Barry Beckett, Ben Montench, and Steve Nathan. Let's see. All right, Barry Beckett played piano, or Barry Beckett played, organ and piano, and Ben Mont played Wurlitzer, and Steve Nathan played synthesizer. And there's no synthesizer on the record, for one thing. And the piano solo I played on Rainy Night in Georgia is one of my favorites ever, and yet it's not credited to me, and it's and Barry Beckett's organ part was so cool, and he's not credited with that. It's just a shame. That stuff happens every once in a while.
It is incredibly frustrating, though, Steve. I always see that as the equivalent of an artist painting a painting and then having someone else's name signed at the bottom of it.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a simple, honest mistake, and sometimes it's just flat laziness. The great session drummer Carlos Vega told me he got credited more than once as Carl Las Vegas, and I don't know if you know who Mark Chestnut is, but I know that it probably frustrated him to no end that the clavinet part I played on one of his records got credited as Steve Nathan clarinet.
Well, we're pleased at the Keyboard Chronicles to be setting the record straight right here with all these miscreditings. So this is our chance to set the record straight for history. So thank you for sharing that, Steve. Let's zoom quite a bit into the future from where we just were. Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, I can't really, not much to brag on. I played on, I'm going to say, 4 songs with Taylor, and the record company rejected all of them. Oh. And with Byron Gallimore was a producer, and Byron Gallimore is a big successful hit producer. Produced almost all of Tim McGraw and Faith Hill's stuff and lots of records. But the record company just felt like the tracks that we cut for Taylor weren't, or she wasn't happy. I didn't really get to sit in on the meeting for when they decided they weren't happy with them. So I played on her cut of Tim McGraw and 3 or 4 of the songs that went on to be her breakout hits. But they were all recut with Nathan Chapman producing and a different band. So, I knew her, I met her, we had nice chats and ate lunch together, but I didn't make it to the final record.
Well, that was it. No wonder she didn't go anywhere, Steve. That was a big oversight. So.
She was very sweet, but you could tell even at that really young age, she was laser focused on becoming successful, on becoming a star. And she had, you could tell she always was thinking about who's looking at me, how should I be sitting, how do I need to pose, is there a camera in here, is there a camera over there, when I'm getting up to say hello to this person, do I go, she was thinking about every aspect of looking and acting like a star.
Yeah, that's an amazing insight. And you mentioned another big star, Steve, that you have worked quite extensively with, and that's Tim McGraw.
Yeah, I've done a lot of his records, and I did a lot of his early stuff that wasn't a hit. But the record did come out, and I was on them, and I managed to stay with them. There was a short time in there where he moved from one producer to another producer who was more used to cutting with Matt Rollins than me, and so they started that record with Matt Rollins, and then they started calling me in to come in and redo some of Matt's stuff or add to some of Matt's stuff. So on some of the records, I think when he first started with James Stroud, I'm only on part of those records, but then once he shifted to once he started having hits, I became the primary keyboard player for all of that stuff.
And why do you think that was, Steve? What was the success of that relationship?
I had a good relationship with a lot of producers for pretty much the same reason. And this gets into that whole discussion about why being a successful studio musician isn't the same as being a great keyboard player, or it's not the same as being the best piano player in the town or the room or whatever. It's a completely different set of skills and a different part of the brain. And I've always been pretty good at that. I have sort of a gift for somebody will come into the studio and they'll go, here's my song, and they'll sort of ham-fist it out because they're not a great guitar player. They'll sing the words they wrote and the melody they wrote. And I have a pretty good sense. I can hear that and get a good idea of what are they trying to say? What are they trying to get across? And not just for the keyboard part, but for the whole record, for the whole band. I will typically get a richer, deeper, more complex sense than the other musicians on the session. And a lot of record producers learned, when I hire Steve, he does a lot of my job for me in a sense. He comes to me and says, we really ought to try this with hand drums and a stand-up bass, or, she's got a great song there, but her bridge really ought to come before that third chorus, not after, and those kind of things. I tend to hear a lot of things, and I often will hear simple things that have larger than small effect on the big picture. So I might turn to the producer and go, if that bridge, instead of going to that 4 chord and then the 6 minor chord, if it went to the 6 minor and then a flat 7, add 9, she wouldn't have to change the melody, and it'll take the thing someplace else completely in a way that I think it needs to, because the listener's ear is already kind of tired of what they've heard at that point if they repeat it. And I have a lot of I have a gift for doing that a lot. And I became the guy that, all of the musicians on the sessions that I worked with, almost all the musicians always know something's not right here. We're doing this, and we're getting to this part, and you get to the end and you just go, boy, something's wrong. And I became the guy where all the other musicians would go, and my nickname was Prez. They'd go, Prez, fix it. And so a lot of producers, and Barry Beckett was certainly the same way. I learned so much about making records from Barry Beckett, and I knew this. I knew just when he left Muscle Shoals and came to Nashville. He'd gotten a job doing A&R for Warner Brothers Records, but he wanted to do sessions as well, and he got booked on a lot of records for that exact same reason. Producers, there's a lot of really, really talented, good producers who are good because they can recognize, they know when a song is a hit, they know when it's going to be a hit. They may not know how to get it there, but they know it's a hit song. They know it fits, they know how to pick the material that fits the artist. They know how to do a lot of things. They know how to make the artist feel comfortable in the studio. But the sort of nuts and bolts of arranging, a lot of them are kind of weak in that area. And they hire guys like me or Barry Beckett to be on their sessions because they know we're going to help them make a better record.
And Steve, I think you've raised a brilliant point there, and I'm going to veer off now and just say, do you feel that's still the case as much with modern music production? So even that great example you gave of chord structure and transitioning with verses and choruses and so on, and there was obviously that stuff released in the last couple of months that key changes even in modern music have essentially reduced to zero. Do you think that's something we've lost?
Oh, it's something that's definitely missing. And whether it'll come back, I'm old enough to have been through a lot of sort of down periods in popular music, only to have something come out of nowhere. And like the music business always does, something great breaks through and hits, and they all go, let's do that. And then you all do that for a while. But yeah, I think it's missing. And it's a little more complicated, I think, this time than it might have been when everybody was cutting disco and it took grunge or something else to break out. I grew up in a fairly large city, so I was exposed to a lot of different kinds of music, And I can tell this story from the country music perspective in particular, because I've spent the last 32 years in Nashville. I spent 14 years in Muscle Shoals before that, but I've spent the last 32 in Nashville, and I've sort of watched what sort of has come and gone in country music. And what was always interesting to me was that for most of that time in country music, you would find artists, songwriters, even record producers who had grown up exposed to only one kind of music. They came from little towns, little farm towns. Tony Brown, one of the greatest producers on the planet, grew up in a little bitty town in Mississippi where the only radio station you could get was the gospel station, nothing else. Kids that grew up on farms or grew up in little tiny communities, they never heard anything that wasn't George Jones and Ray Price. They weren't exposed to anything. And that's gone on every corner of the planet now. You can be a kid in the middle of nowhere riding a tractor, and you've got Spotify playing rap from Afghanistan in your earphones. We're a couple of generations in now to kids that aren't limited into what they're exposed to. So naturally, it brought all of these other influences into all music, not just popular music. It certainly brought it into country music. And somewhere in the 2000s or so, as young kids in the South were listening to rap and hip hop, it changed the nature of the kind of songwriters they became. And it changed the nature of the kind of artists they wanted to be. Like I said, I'm mostly retired now, but when I was still going and doing sessions, and I would find myself on sessions with these young 19, 20-year-old artists, I would find exactly what was natural to me. I would be inclined to say, your song has these two chords in one bar and these two chords in the other bar, and it never changes. It's the same all the way through, and it never changes. And your melody has 3 notes in it, and it never changes. And their response was always, "Yeah, isn't that great?" And that was the sort of sign for me that maybe it was time for me to start looking for other things to do. I started writing more and working on things just for my own pleasure, and being a lot more selective about what sessions I took. So yeah, it's. I don't want to blame hip hop. Hip hop is an art form of it in its own right. But the popular music of that generation has reduced country music and pop music down to very basic, repetitive, where the structure doesn't really change. You take instruments out and you put things in. You make it bigger, you make it smaller. You drop all of the things except some little thing over here, but it's still the same thing, and the lyrics are unbelievably repetitive and with very little thought. And it's particularly sad in country music because a great songwriter, George Jackson, said to me a long, long time ago, he said, well, in country music, it really matters what the words mean, and in pop music, it just matters how the words sound. And he was right. But popular country music today doesn't tell the stories that it used to. It doesn't speak colloquially to the listener. It doesn't. It's become kind of throwaway. It's popular for a little while, and then it's off your Spotify list, and kids. Like I said, there's a couple of generations that aren't really terribly invested in their music. It's it's a lot like wallpaper. A lot of it is a lot of younger people think of music in terms as it's part of a bigger, it's part of a visual art form. It's almost to the point that it's accompaniment to a visual medium, and not the sort of thing that, you know, I don't know how old you guys are, but you and I probably all sat with headphones absorbing every syllable, every instrument. What is that? What is that sound? What is that thing doing? What does he say there? What does that mean? You know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not the same now, and it's you know, I'm hoping that there's some sort of rebellion similar to what we've seen in the past. But it's so much harder for, you know, I mean, if you got a band and you write songs and you want to make it, it's so much harder to sustain yourself long enough to develop a career and become known. It's harder to get paid, harder to earn money from your songs. All of it is so much harder. And from the studio musician perspective, and this is something I've been working on legislatively a lot lately, a 20-year-old musician coming into it like I did when I was 20 years old just doesn't have the kind of opportunity that I had. I could live longer on a lot less money, for one thing, and there was a way in. A lot of musicians got their start just by doing songwriter demos for years, and you could make a decent living from doing songwriter demos. And eventually you would play something on a demo that would get cut by somebody as a record, and they go, "Who played that piano on there? I want that guy." And that's how your career would move forward. But, you know, the record company rosters are a third to a quarter the size of what they used to be. The budgets are smaller than what they used to be. And the requirement, we used to cut an average record, we would cut in a minimum of 10 to 15 sessions. And that was fast. That was considered fast by LA and New York standards. But we would spend 2 to 3, 3-hour sessions a day for 5 or 6 days and get the whole record tracked. Then, of course, they would do all the overdubbing and the mixing and the singing and all that. But nowadays, the record companies expect the same kind of musicians to go into a studio, and they want them to come out 3 hours later with 5 of the tracks. And 6 hours later, they want 10 songs. So a musician trying to do what I did now is going to make a tenth of what I made for a whole record, and they're only going to get to make, 10 records a year when I got to make 30 or 40 or whatever it was. And even the songwriter, the publishing companies have less money, so they've cut the advances, and they cut the demo budget, so everything is much smaller. And the musicians who can't give it up are all, they're giving Skype lessons, they're playing on the weekends with this person, they're riding a bus with that person over here, they're working in a music store, they're doing everything they can to try and stay alive. But the lack of any sustainability means that a lot of musicians who would have been able to tough it out and be somebody and do something meaningful are dropping out because they got families to feed.
That's right.
And it's really hurting, what I think is our greatest export to the rest of the world. American music is, it's treasured all over the world, but I think it's suffering from the music economy.